Tom Calma is a human rights and social justice campaigner who has worked within several fields including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, mental health and suicide prevention, disability, education, economic development and Aboriginal reconciliation. Tom has led the creation of the Closing the Gap campaign and was a member of the recently completed review of senior secondary pathways. He is currently the Chancellor of the University of Canberra across the road and the second Indigenous Chancellor of any Australian university in history. Tom Calma is an incredibly impressive man and his intellect, compassion and actions are inspirational. Today he will be talking about reconciliation. Please give a very warm welcome to Tom Calma and his talk titled Reconciliation, Thinking and You.
Oh, thank you, Georgie. And can I say that I was very impressed with both the chapters we discussed earlier from Richard and Brooke, because there's a lot of synergy between what I'll be talking about tonight and what they've talked about. And what's interesting is we didn't collaborate at all, so it's by luck more than anything. Can I thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us on this very important event that's hosted by the students of Radford College. Before I start, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet tonight, the Ngunnawal peoples. I pay respects to their cultures, their knowledges, their unbroken connection to country, and their elders past, present and future. People who have lived, loved, raised their families and cared for their country for millennia before the arrival of the British that saw the subsequent dispossession of lands, cultures and languages across the nation. I'd also like to acknowledge all youth, and I mean all youth, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who will be our future leaders, the custodians of our stories, our cultures, our languages and our histories. I emphasise youth because at the last census, over 50% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population was under 14 years of age, and also because we are here tonight and tomorrow with the youth-led Dirrum Festival. Despite the killings, the theft of lands and resources and the prohibition of ceremonies and use of mother tongue, despite the forced removal of children and the destruction of sacred and other sites of significance, our people continue to survive and identify. The continued survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with distinct identities, languages and cultures is unquestionably our greatest triumph. Much regrettably has been lost, and today we struggle to retain our languages and our culture. However, there is light on the horizon. I co-chair the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, and I should say, because you'll be talking about him a bit later, Adam Goods is also a member of the ALNF with me. And while a key objective of ours is early language and literacy teaching and empowerment, we are also passionate to record, preserve and revive the teaching of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages and subsequently positively impact cultures. Globally, it's estimated that around 221 million children of Indigenous and minority languages backgrounds do not have access to early education in their local language. In Australia at the time of colonisation, there were over 800 languages and dialects spoken, and the latest 2014 National Indigenous Language Survey identified only 120 languages still existing, but only 13 of these are considered secure because all generations speak the language. So we went from 800 down to now less than 120. Between 2005 and 2014, an estimated 5 languages have become critically endangered in Australia. And globally, it's estimated by the United Nations that 1 Indigenous language is lost every 14 days. This is a global challenge and a crisis. The ALNF, as I mentioned, may have found the solution through our Living First Language app. The app received 6 significant global awards in 2019 and 2020, and the last 2 were awarded in Vienna in March this year, just days before the global pandemic pandemic was announced. I should have been there to do the pitch and subsequently accept the awards, but I chickened out, something that I don't regret now that we know the impacts of COVID-19, especially in Europe. To date in Australia, we've recorded 6 languages, revived 1, and are currently working on 3 other language recording projects. We have also commenced working with the Navajo Nation in North America to record and teach their language, but unfortunately COVID-19 has put a stop to that as their community has been consumed by the virus. The app also becomes a tool for teaching and of the language, both orally and in written form, and it's also able to be translated into English. Now, one of the languages we are currently working on is in the Torres Strait. The initiative is part of a 2-year project that involves community training and the production of the Irub Mer digital language and literacy resource that can be edited, updated and expanded into the future. So let me now turn to the theme of this lecture, reconciliation, thinking and you. I've chosen reconciliation because it accords with the values of the Dirrum Festival. Recognise the reality, see the possibilities. Inspire intelligent, effective engagement and action, and lead transformation for a greater and common good. So what is reconciliation? What should it look like? Is it the same everywhere? Who is it for? What purpose should it serve? How will we know if we've succeeded? These big questions for Australian society are also the questions that Radford students, from your most junior to your most senior students, must ask when you contemplate the type of society you want for your future. These are the type of questions that must be discussed around the dinner table. Reconciliation, that is the building of stronger relationships between non-Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for the benefit of all, goes beyond simple words on paper to be a lived and vibrant ethos permeating all we do. It's not a new concept. Reconciliation has been the pebble in the nation's shoe since the moment of colonisation, but it took clearer shape in 1932 when William Cooper formed the Australian Aborigines League to petition for representation in the federal parliament. 40 years later, Neville Bonner was elected as Australia's first Aboriginal parliamentarian. Clearly, it's not something achieved overnight. Another 40 plus years on, and we haven't achieved it yet. What is searingly apparent is that reconciliation is not something that can be achieved by government decree. Governments cannot force reconciliation, but it can provide the fertile ground for it to germinate and take root. Governments can and should play a leading role in guiding the nation, and at times it has, such as Prime Minister Paul Keating's landmark Redfern speech. But while governments cannot compel reconciliation, reconciliation can certainly be hampered by a lack of political will and inaction. Reconciliation is the expression of mutual respect and acceptance amongst us, the people, individually and collectively. The most recent collective manifestation of Australia's First Nations aspirations is the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The statement starts with a declaration of First Nations sovereignty. It says, "Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to the sciences more than 60,000 years ago." The statement goes on to remind the Australian people that this sovereignty, and I'll quote from the document, has never been ceded or extinguished, and coexist with the sovereignty of the Crown. A few paragraphs later, its writers and endorsees get right to the point. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them, and our youth language in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of powerlessness. Powerlessness, the torment of powerlessness. These few words so well describe the cause of our contemporary predicament and the outcomes: powerlessness and torment. The Uluru Statement also calls for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. In November 2019, Professor Marcia Langton AM and I were appointed as co-chairs of the Senior Advisory Group of the Indigenous Voice co-design process being run by the Australian Government. It's a very complex task, but we're up for the challenge. And later this year, we'll be testing our findings with all Australians, and I mean all Australians, and we invite you to critically assess what we propose, because we won't progress with a voice to Parliament without the support of all Australians. On the 28th of May this year, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Bridge Walk, when over 300,000 people crossed the Sydney Harbour Bridge and thousands more walked across bridges elsewhere in support of reconciliation. We've still not arrived. And that brings me to Captain James Cook. It involves another anniversary, this one 250 years. Since the earliest times, there's been a predominant narrative in history that Cook came and found us, that we were somehow non-existent until we were discovered. Wrong. We were here. We've been here for at least 80,000 years. We have histories, complex societies, commerce, languages, agriculture and belief systems. It was we who discovered Cook had landed, a visitor, but not the first in our time as custodianship of the continent. It was difficult this time because Cook claimed the land, ignoring our existing connection to country, our customs, our communities and our governance systems. It was a grave injustice and remains so to this day, because it remains unaddressed. But we have no treaty and we have no constitutional voice. 250 years on, there were plans for a cruise recreating Cook's journey, circumnavigating the continent, celebrating his achievement. Now, I don't denigrate the fortitude it would have required to be an explorer in his era, sailing upon the high seas. But would we not be richer as a nation if we were to celebrate the people with a history stretching back millennia, whose knowledges and capacities and resourcefulness and creativity saw them thrive? It are these first peoples of Australia, with this established and enduring society, who looked outwards and discovered Cook. Cruising in a replica vessel and looking from the sea to land is looking in the wrong direction. We have an opportunity as a nation to reverse the perspective, to see things differently, to hear the voices of those who lived here long before many of us featured in the Western consciousness, to learn, to trust, to understand, to share. To share. Sharing is a reciprocal act. It's not give and take. Sharing requires understanding, and to be understood, we must be heard. This brings me back to the theme of the lecture: reconciliation, thinking, and you. To have a voice and to be heard requires someone to listen. It's a shared process, just like reconciliation. And I invite you to think long and hard about your individual role in reconciliation. At its heart, reconciliation rests with us as individuals. It is our personal commitment to a fairer, equitable, culturally enriched and accepting nation that will determine whether reconciliation is achieved. Ultimately, it comes down to the willingness of individuals to embrace in their hearts the unity, equity, acceptance and understanding that is necessary for the flickering sparks of reconciliation to take hold and burn brightly. So please think first, then put those thoughts into action. That's how reconciliation can and will happen. Now, the 5 dimensions of reconciliation: equality and equity, unity, institutional integrity, race relations and historical acceptance are the cornerstones of our future as a unified Australia. Reconciliation is not about a guilt trip or laying blame on events of the past, but it's about acknowledging the past and sharing the lessons and ensuring that the lessons learnt and shared are not repeated unless, of course, they have beneficial outcomes. We've come a long way in the past 2 decades since the formation of Reconciliation Australia, but we still have a way to go to be a just, equitable and reconciled Australia. Now, I'll focus only on 2 dimensions tonight: historical acceptance, where the goal is for all Australians to understand and accept the wrongs of the past and impacts of these wrongs, and also on race relations. Historical acceptance also requires that Australia makes amends for the wrongs of the past and ensures that these wrongs are never repeated. Community and formal education are key vehicles to raise awareness in the community. Initiatives and strategies like Reconciliation Australia's Ngunnawal program supports all schools and early learning services to host a higher level of knowledge and pride in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and contributions. Ngunnawal's online platform is free to access and provides practical ways to introduce meaningful reconciliation initiatives in the classroom, around the school and with the community. Through the Ngunnawal platform, schools and early learning services can develop a reconciliation action plan, or RAP, and I realise you've got one, and teachers and educators can access professional learning and curriculum resources to support the implementation of reconciliation initiatives. Now, Radford's RAP and reconciliation initiatives may benefit from exposure to the Ngunnawal platform. As of 31 December 2019, a total of 5,225 schools and early learning services have commenced the Ngunnawal RAP, and 46,217 individual users were registered on the Ngunnawal platform. So we are seeing the enlightenment of the next generation, our children, who will be more knowledgeable and informed of Australia's full history and pre-contact prehistory than many of us here today. I'm talking mainly of the older generation. Another still example of understanding and healing relates to the Myall Creek massacres and memorial site. The Wirrawai and Gamilaroi people, in partnership with the local non-Indigenous community, have established a memorial on the site of the massacres as a symbol of reconciliation and a place of education. District schools and representatives of all the shires in the region participate in the annual services held on site. The Myall Creek Memorial is also a place of healing for the descendants of both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people involved in the Myall massacre. With the gains we've seen at Myall Creek, what is the local knowledge of and future of other massacre sites? As of January 2020, there were 311 documented frontier massacres over the period of 140 years. The first of these occurred when British settlers in the Hawkesbury River killed 7 Bidjigal people in reprisal for the theft of clothing and provisions, and the last massacre occurred as late as 1928 in the Northern Territory, a time that is in the memory of Australians living today. The University of Newcastle is rigorously and methodically documenting these events, and I congratulate Professor Lyndall Ryan and her team on this work. I'd also encourage the Radford community to visit the Myall Creek Memorial and Massacre site when you visit Tingha, Moree or Armidale. Hand in hand with historical acceptance is truth-telling. Now, I believe that RA's work bears this out, that Australia is ready for a broader discussion on truth-telling. In fact, I believe there is a thirst for it, a desire to better understand our shared history. The 2018 Reconciliation Barometer found that 80% of the broader community believed it is important to undertake truth-telling processes. 86% believed it important that we learn about past issues, and 80% believed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are important to our national identity. Now, a few years ago, the town of Gundagai honoured Yari, Jackie and other Wiradjuri men who rescued an estimated 69 people during the Great Floods of 1852. On 25 June 2017, on the 165th anniversary of the Great Floods, a bronze statue of Yari and Jackie titled The Great Rescue of 1852 was unveiled in the main street of Gundagai by Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack. A great gesture, and there should be more of it. And, you know, assembling more statues recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander achievement is far better than pulling down statues of Cook and Co. They should stand together so that we can have a discussion and understand our past and what we can do for the future. Now, race relations is the most challenging and vexed dimension of reconciliation. A just, equitable and reconciled Australia will only come to pass when all Australians understand and value Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous cultures, rights and experiences, which result in a stronger relationship based on trust and respect and that are free of racism. Now, racism is practiced consciously and unconsciously, and too often it is influenced by unconscious bias. It is also referred to as casual racism, as it is somehow the belief of some that it's more acceptable if racism is perpetrated in a non-formal way or is a slip of the tongue or said in jest. Shock jocks and other media personalities and other personalities are too often the chief offenders. I say that no form of racism is acceptable, and society knows this, but it still occurs too commonly, and it is defended too readily under the guise of free speech or expression, most often to deflect or defend the offender's poor behaviour. A public apology or excuse when caught out is a hollow, disingenuous gesture from someone who is likely to re-offend, albeit surreptitiously. Addressing racism, discrimination and prejudice is important not only to ensure that we are an inclusive and fair society, but also because of the adverse physical and mental health and societal impacts on individuals, and we see that too often, and there was a reference earlier to suicides, and that is potentially one of the leading contributors in the way that people feel about themselves because they're being denigrated by others. Now is the time for all of us to explore and address our own unconscious biases and reflect on the important practice that racism stops with me. If racism stops with me, we will address racism. And not me, but all of us. Now, and I must say that, you know, I, as well as we all do, have unconscious biases that have been developed over a lifetime generally, and it's because of what we see, what we hear. And as long as we just trust that and not question it, then we are perpetrators. Now let me close by reiterating that as a nation we must understand and celebrate our shared history and our First Peoples, who are the longest continuing surviving peoples of the world. Peoples who endured the Ice Age, floods, fires, introduced diseases, subjugation, and who coexisted with megafauna. We are survivors who call on all Australians in the spirit of Dirrum to walk with us and support us into the future. Together, and to honour the theme of the festival, Tipping Point, Forces for Change, we must recognise, inspire and lead. Thank you.